Hey guys, it's Bully from Bully's Painting Parlour again, and welcome back to the latest in our series of vids. Today's lesson is going to be lesson 6, and this will be part 1 of lesson 6. Lesson 6 is around colour versus texture and how the two can be used incredibly successfully together to create some pretty advanced effects once you start to get a bit more competent with the science and the process of how to use them. So you can see in front of you a quick work in progress of 3 of the awesome Forge World grot tanks that I am busily knocking up at the minute. And the requirement for these is for them to be really battered, very old, very rusty, very rickety, exactly as you'd expect grot vehicles to be. And I'm at the intermediate to advanced stages of prepping these before I start putting in brush free hands and details and everything else. So these are pretty much all done with an airbrush to this point. In fact, they are entirely done with an airbrush to this point, which is why it's quite interesting. And you'll notice that the OSL and stuff isn't complete. That's just the base colours and starting to put the blends in and everything else. But we'll talk about OSL in another lesson. We don't want to do too much in one go. So the grot tanks, it occurred to me while I was doing them, it provided me with an ideal canvas to talk to you about colour placement and how you work in theory of building up colour placement and then working back down again with an airbrush. And also the use of techniques like salt weathering and ink overlays and pigment washes and everything else to start to create this really kind of battered armour. So I will take 2 of these out of the way, and we'll focus on this little chap here. So first off, this is how I prep all my models for painting. I will generally drill them and stick a large pin. I use pop rivet shanks. I think that pop rivet shanks are absolutely brilliant for pinning models. Primarily because they're strong, they cut with hobby cutters really well. They're often quite long and they're 1.5mm thick. And that's perfect for a good piece of strength. And then I just mount them, just drill them into a base. And if there's anything I'm painting ancillary to the tank, in this case the drivers, then they will get magnetised and on the same block, so I can keep the whole commission together. So on this grot tank you can see a vast array. I'll try and use a brush. I'm sorry, I've got a real bad cold today. You can see a pretty vast array of different textures and procedures that have been done. This is actually about 15 colours overlaid from each other, but it really isn't difficult and it doesn't take a great deal of time. And then you can see various different penetration weathering here. And I see stuff all the time on YouTube in particular about weathering and salt weathering and hairspray methods and all sorts of stuff like that. And it, like everything else, it's overcomplicated. It's really a case of just keep it simple, and if you keep it simple you can produce some of the most incredible effects. So when you are painting a tank and you want to weather it up, start with a really dark colour. So start with a deep brown, the base coat colour that you're actually going to want to have in terms of your rust, and then in random places around the tank place burnt umbers and reds and oranges and even the tinge of yellow and blue. Because it doesn't matter at that stage, you are not going to have that as your final colour. You are just mapping in colours and textures on the tank's armour, and then you're going to cover them over. But when you add the final colour, or even I do this in stages actually, so I'll add a little bit more with each different colour layer I add because it builds up texture. When the paint is wet from the airbrush, just sprinkle a little bit of table salt directly onto the model. The table salt will stick just about to the wet paint, and it will stay in place comfortably for you to airbrush over the top of it. And then instead of worrying about having a model that's covered with hairspray or washing it off or any of that crap, all you do is you take a brush at the end of the painting process and you just scrape away the salt, revealing whichever layer of texture you have underneath. And another great tip, I don't scrape away all the salt. So if you've got areas where some of the salt is a little bit more resilient and it wants to stay there, leave it there and then add pigment or ink or whatever else to build up and utilize that as texture, because rust isn't flat. Rust adds, as you know, it bobbles, it crackles, it's all sorts of 3D textures. And in this, you can see, just on this one tank, so many different layers of paint and colour. I really wanted it to look ramshackle. So here you can see that I armoured up the plates, and I sanded it back, and then I added a stencil, and then I chipped the stencil away, and then I added the top cover, and I finally chipped away the top cover to reveal the original stencil. So this vehicle's been remarked a couple of times, and it's been intentionally done haphazardly, as if the grot mechanics themselves have left certain spray lines all over it, and it adds colour and depth. And then these sorts of effects are final stage overlays when you're using an ink through an airbrush. So chestnut ink, or a kind of dark brown ink. Chestnut I find is best for rust because it's translucent, so it'll spread out and you'll get this pigmentation spread that leads into the darker points. But ink will airbrush phenomenally well, and it's the only thing you'll ever put through your airbrush that you don't need to thin. You don't need to put any thinners on airbrush inks at all. I find that scale 75 ink tense range are the best for pigment coloration, but they're not necessarily the best if you want to keep a translucent effect. So this is chestnut ink from scale 75. Some of these other inks, the blues and stuff, which you probably can't see on camera, are Games Workshop inks, or from Vallejo inks. So if we just turn the tank onto the angle here, you can see the real depth of the damage here, and this is done using layers and layers and layers of paint, but in translucent form. So I'll start by laying the rust foundation colours that we talked about, and then I will spray a thin lighter colour, which is the original base armour of the tank. In this instance it was very similar to a kind of bone Death Guard green colour. And then I'll chip that away, and then I'll add a bit more salt, and then I'll start to overlay with translucent inks, because I want to look like the metal itself was old when it was painted, and then I want the rust to be coming through in various different stages. So we want this particular armour to look like it's been painted lots of times, and it's really ramshackle. And then the use of spot colours with the chipping medium, in terms of the salt weathering and scratches and everything else, will really add depth to the armour, and it will draw the eye extremely well. So on these you can see I've used a very deep, very dark red. It's utterly unhighlighted, so this is just the base red, which I've put on at scale 75. Deep red is my favourite colour of any acrylic paint. And then what I've done is stenciled on top of that. Now, a really good top tip for all budding airbrush artists: stencils are really hard to use well, and we'll do a whole session on stenciling later in this series. But there is a phenomenal array of variety of self-adhesive stencils open to the hobby community that they wouldn't normally consider, and that is nail art stencils. If you go onto eBay and you put in nail art stencils, you will find hundreds of perfectly sized stencils which are self-adhesive with a light tack, which are fingernail sized and therefore ideal for wargaming models. And this is a skull and crossbones stencil from a nail art provider, and it's, well, brilliant, quite frankly. So as the theme of these kind of armoured pirates grots, you'll see that all of the armours have these markings on them in numerous different places. The theme for these is as I said, it's a rebel grot pirate unit, or land pirate unit. And you know, just using the spot colours and the details really does break up the tanks. And obviously in here the eyes of the skull will be painted as a viewing platform, as glass, which is just a nice little twist. So once you lay your spot colours down and you put your stenciling and airbrushes on, you get to the point where the tank to paint to this level took me about an hour, and that's not an exaggeration. It took about an hour, with the time taken to swap the colours out, but I did 5 tanks at the same time, so the combined paint time for the tanks is, you know, no more than 20 minutes each, all said and done, in terms of getting them to this point. And a lot of gamers, I think, will probably be pretty happy with them at this point. Obviously, this is nowhere near finished for my work, But this is the point where we take over with a brush, and you'll hear me always advocate the use of brush and airbrush together. And what I'm going to do now is start to place by hand. I'll probably use Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop because it's a phenomenally versatile shading ink. And I'm going to do all these rivets and all this checker plating, and I'm going to put real depth into the stuff that I've airbrushed to bring it out and to make the detail pop. I'm then going to hand paint scratches with a white line or a light line and a dark line. And I will start to put on grot text by hand and little signs and all sorts of stuff just to bring them out. Paint in all the viewing panes, start to highlight and bring out all of the tracks, but we can keep the tracks fairly neutral and muddy, which is really, really important to keep them neutral and muddy. And then we can start to put in the spot colours and stuff, and then I will come back and I will overlay with successive inks on top of this mapping I've done in terms of weathering the exhausts, and especially the flamers. I'll be putting sort of heat burn and flame effects on them. And I won't be shy about using spot colours in terms of cabling, because I want it to look like it's been scavenged from everything. But before we actually start me spraying stuff and showing you while I'm doing it, I figured it would be interesting to talk about the placements and the build-ups and give you an example on camera of how these textures and stuff are added. So we've got like a minute or so left until I get to the limit for a YouTube upload. And you can see the variety here where I've chipped and then I've oversprayed it again very lightly, so it looks like it's been repainted on the top of previous rust chipping. And then down here it's not been repainted and it's darker and darker, and then where the water would collect there's a lot of damage and pitting and chipping. And it's really nice because it means you can just, on the areas that a little grot would see, the stuff's been more readily and more evenly repainted. On the areas that a grot can't get to, it's pretty minging. And the detail in these Forge World models really lends itself for adding depth and shading. So these checker plate pieces with the big dents, I often get a knife and chisel out more dents and cracks because I'm a big fan of texture in models. I think it helps you to lead the brush. So there we go, I've waffled at you for 13 minutes. And in the next lesson, what I will do is take some of this theory and apply it to a vehicle. I will weather up something. I don't know what it is I'll actually paint. Maybe you could post some comments and suggest what it is I actually demonstrate on. I'll be fairly flexible. I'm doing a massive Tau army at the minute for my Winter Dawn project, and they're all weathered in the same way, but less than these. Or I can just get another independent tank and paint it however the audience wants me to. Quite frankly, maybe we can give it away afterwards as a bit of a, I don't know, incentive or something. So if you've got an idea about what you'd like me to see and what you'd like me to paint this technique onto in front of the camera on part 2 of lesson 6, then please post a comment. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Cheers, bye.